thanks for joining us and sticking with us. We are going to talk about issues relating to how that you have to deal with as employees return to the workplace. Hopefully one of them is not the technology issue that we have here. But in all seriousness, there's obviously, as you folks know, there's a multitude of issues. I mean, that's why we have 200 plus people on this webinar. And so we're going to talk about safety issues. We're going to talk about collective bargaining issues, discipline. We're going to talk about some testing and ADA issues. And we would encourage you to ask questions. We will do our best to answer those questions. We will likely go about an hour to an hour and a half, starting now, not at 11. And again, there's going to be, the one thing that I think that is the most true thing that we can say, and thank you, Dan Kelso, for telling me I don't need to yell, so I'll talk a little quieter. One of the things that is most obvious and most significant that folks should keep in mind is you got to be flexible. Things are going to change, and they change daily, and we all know that. And we need to be flexible, and we all want answers, and some of the people we work for want answers now, and sometimes we can't give those answers. So we're going to do our best to help you walk through these things and, of course, keep you updated as things continue to change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, and she's going to talk about some safety-related issues here.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and hello, everyone. Hopefully, everyone can hear me okay. And as far as implementing safety directives, as Mark indicated, one of the biggest things that we see, and we saw it from the governor in the state earlier this week, is that things will be changing, and they will be changing quickly. I think one of the most important things to do is to communicate clearly with employees, especially as they're returning to work during this very uncertain time. As far as notice requirements, we want to make sure folks are clearly delineating to employees what it is that they need to expect when they come back to work. So are you going to be requiring masks for both employees and customers or clients coming into your facilities or visitors? What are your social distancing guidelines? Make sure to include those, post them, communicate them as quickly as possible with employees so that way they feel comfortable coming back to work. Clearly outlining expectations. One of the things that we've seen from the governor's office as well as the state is to prohibit congregating in certain areas like the lunchroom. Make sure you are consistently enforcing prohibitions on that. Make sure you are communicating with employees that they are not permitted to congregate in certain areas. And I know I'm probably going to have to make sure that I'm being self-aware and not getting close to people, but supervisors and directors also need to be held accountable. And I think everyone should feel comfortable telling one another, you are too close to me right now, without having to be afraid of being rude or anything like that. So, and also if you are, suspending certain work rules or you're modifying certain work rules, clearly communicate with employees how long those things are going to be suspended, and you may have to suspend them for the next 6 months, but make sure folks know what's required of them right now. And Mark, it sounded like you had a comment to make.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to talk a minute about the idea of implementing written safety directives. Look, I think having written rules and written policies that's what you should do. I mean, we all know that that's best practices. In this situation, I think you should also attempt to have policies on some of the bigger issues, the more important issues, like, and we'll talk about it, maybe you already have it, wearing masks and taking employee temperatures, things like that. But one of the things, it seems to me that one of the difficulties here, unlike other areas, is having a uniform policy from employer to employer to employer. There are going to be more variations here, I believe. And in fact, I had a call with a client yesterday who said, can you put together a policy on X? And my response was, maybe you should take your first crack at it, and I'll review it and make suggestions. Because, again, what I might think is important, I don't have a clue about how their workplace actually works. So, but again, to the extent you can get written directives out, you should do that, understanding that they're going to have to be modified as situations changes. And don't forget about your obligations if you have a collective bargaining agreement to at least confer with the union or let the union know what's going on. More communication is better than less when possible.
And if you do have a workplace rule provision in your collective bargaining agreement where you have to wait 10 days before it's effective, maybe talk to your union rep and see if they would agree to suspend that requirement so that you can ensure that everyone is being safe as possible. I think Mark was going to go to the next slide.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to the next slide.
We are maintaining a social distance, so we're not both in control of the clicker right now. Safety issues, I think we've heard this a lot, is taking employees' temperatures. The recommended, threshold is 100.4 degrees for whether someone is running a fever. You want to make sure that if you do require, I think that the governor's office has said you should be reporting employee temperatures or requiring employees to tell you or taking employees' temperatures as they're coming in the door. So when you do that, you want to make sure maybe this is the time to have a policy where you're designating who is in fact responsible for doing that. Maybe that's when you want to mark on the floor where employees need to stand as they're waiting to come to work. It may take them a little bit longer to get into work because you have to take their temperatures. For the employees that are doing the temperature taking, again, want to make sure that social distancing is being enforced and that the people who are doing it understand the importance of keeping that information confidential. According to the EEOC, if you are maintaining a log of employee temperatures, then that information has to be sequestered and kept confidential. So those employees who are doing it need to understand the importance of keeping that information to themselves. Now,
you don't have to keep a log, even if
You don't.
you're taking temperature. Again, if you want to, as Stephanie just told you, this, you have to keep it confidential, of course. But at the same time, if you are, if you're keeping an employee log, then of course, one of the reasons to keep that log is to go back and say, hey, we were taking temperatures, and no, we didn't have this person, we didn't let this person in work when they had a temperature of 100.4 or more. But again, that's up to you on the local level.
Absolutely. And as far as what to do if you don't have or cannot get a thermometer right now, then you can't take temperatures. You can require employees to report to you that they aren't feeling feverish. You can require employees to take their own temperatures prior to coming to work. But if employees are unable to get a thermometer prior to coming back to work, you need to make sure, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, maybe you want to do an employee questionnaire for those individuals or maybe for everyone coming into the workplace. Are you feeling feverish today? And make sure that they understand, employees understand that it's important to be honest, that there's not going to be any retaliation for an employee who says they can't come to work today, have a fever. And we want to know that information because we do not want you coming to work. And I will say I will probably struggle with this if I'm running a fever because I'm someone who comes to work even if I'm, coughing up a lung because I like to come to work and do my job and feel like people are relying on me. But in this circumstance, we don't want you to come.
I, on the other hand, stay home as often as possible.
He's never here.
So we got a couple questions relating to this. First of all, can we have an employee sign a form that they will take their own temperature each day before they come to the office? Again, the answer is absolutely yes, you can. You can have a directive, as Stephanie said, even without the form. Again, proving that somebody did that is going to be another story, but it's not a bad idea because one of the questions that's going to be asked potentially down the road is, what did you do to keep employees safe? So that's one example you could point to if you want to require employees to sign off on something saying that they're taking their temperature daily. Another question was, would the log be considered public record? I do not believe so. I believe that it's exempt under Ohio. Whether or not it's protected by HIPAA might be, probably is, But whether it is or isn't, it's still exempt from public records under 149.43 of the revised code. So
yeah, and if someone really wants it, you can redact everyone's names on the login. Here's a list of temperatures that people have.
Exactly. And even then, that might be redactable as well.
Correct. Requiring employees to wash hands. I've had several conversations with clients about this. Making sure employees know where the closest sink is. As soon as someone comes to work, maybe include that in your policy, that as soon as they enter the building, they need to wash their hands. Make sure people are washing their hands frequently. I know that there was one facility they were talking about, well, we are going to assign these employees to these sinks, and those are the sinks that those employees are going to be washing hands at. So those are all things you're allowed to do. And I know on there it says other non-intrusive best practices. I have some suggestions, and I'd love to hear yours as well. But, for example, when you go to a government building and you have a sign-in sheet, maybe either have someone sitting there giving a pen and wiping it off as soon as it's done and the person puts it down, or maybe having the employee, obviously at a safe distance, writing that person's name down and having the visitor tell them their name and their phone number rather than having people come in and touch surfaces. Waiting areas, spacing out chairs, disinfecting those chairs after someone leaves, having hand sanitizer ready in various areas, and if you can't find hand sanitizer, what is it that you can do? Well, you need to make sure employees are washing their hands as frequently as possible. Cleaning and sanitizing workplaces throughout the day is obviously something that's going to be happening a lot more. That may have your cleaning staff working more hours. It may require you to potentially hire some temporary employees to conduct those or to perform those activities. Another thing is limiting capacity to meet social distancing guidelines. Maybe that, and I think we're going to talk about this in a second, but maybe that means you have to stagger work hours and have shifts and have people organized in that manner. Mark, do you have any other ideas for best practices?
I don't have any other ideas about that, but I do want to piggyback on something that Stephanie, you just mentioned about hiring staff. Again, there might be collective bargaining issues there. Some of you might have collective bargaining agreements that prohibit you using non-bargaining unit employees on a temporary basis or something like that. Pay attention to those issues. And again, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't hire those folks, but involving the union early on in that process so there's no surprises is going to be smarter. It's going to get you a lot farther than just doing it without telling them. Real quick, we got a question. Is recording the temperature required? No, absolutely not. That's totally up to each individual employer. I don't see a need to record the temperature at all. Unless you feel a real reason to have that record, and some employers may. Another question real quick is if we send someone home because of temperature, how do we document that? I think you probably need to document that, you do need to document that in a manner similar, not dissimilar from how you would treat other medical related information you might get on that employee. So there should be some documentation that is stored in a confidential manner, not likely to be public record. I can't say for sure it's not, but not likely to be public record. And then of course document any follow-up you're doing with that employee as well.
Yeah, I think Mark's right. Maybe you have a sick leave slip that you have employees fill out, when they return to work. Maybe just fill that out and document that employee is in fact being sent home due to their temperature. I think that the recommended practice is to have that employee report their temperature for the next 3 days or 72 hours. And if that employee no longer has a fever, then maybe you can have them return to work. And we can talk about, we'll talk about maybe having that employee do a COVID test in a second, but that is something that is within the CDC's recommended guidelines, is that 72 hours fever-free before the employee comes back to work.
We do have a question. Would employees be required to use their sick leave if they are sent home due to temperature? I think absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that you have the absolute right under these circumstances to require employees to use sick leave if even if they're not asking to use sick leave. Stephanie and I actually had a conversation about this before we got on air, and I think this is the exception. Oftentimes, outside of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is why it's an important question, is because usually you have, if you feel an employee is not fit for duty, whether it's because they're just too sick and coughing up a lung like Stephanie does, or whether they are, just not fit for duty for some other reason, the normal practice is to send them home and tell them, we'll put you on administrative leave with pay until we can get a fitness for duty evaluation. In this situation, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and because of some of the flexibility that you have as employers, I think putting them on sick leave is certainly allowed and smart.
Yeah. And as far as minimizing contact between employees, maybe that's something that's difficult if you work in a dispatching center, that you can't have that 6 feet social distance. You should think about ways to put up barriers. Maybe that's plexiglass, shower curtains. We've had folks talk about doing that, and having those barriers in between one another. One thing that is, I think, all over the place is do not share headsets. So if that is something that you have employees do, you need to think about how you can move beyond that. Definitely disinfect those headsets in between use as much as possible, and maybe look into purchasing more. I know that right now money is tight, but you want to make sure your employees feel safe, and that's something that is blasted all over the news right now, and you don't want someone saying that you're not doing something safely. Another thought that I had was time clock check-in. If you have employees who are reporting to work and have to stamp their time clock, you may have a backlog of employees. Again, maybe that's where you mark the X's on the floor like we see in the supermarket, where you have that 6 feet measured in between everyone. Shared workspaces and equipment, maybe just like assigning employees to sinks, you want to assign employees to computer printers. These employees get to access this printer. These employees get to access this printer. I think a lot of us do that by habit anyways, but grouping it also will be able to, if it will help you if someone does have COVID, you can track who that person should likely have been in contact with because that person was sequestered with these people. Staggered work hours, maybe that's something that will be difficult for you because you have a CBA. Maybe according to your CBA, the work hours are 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And Mark will talk more about this later, but if you do have a good relationship with your union rep in your jurisdiction, reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to do this, because a lot of folks are, budget conscious right now. You don't want to lay people off. We're giving you the opportunity to work. It's just not the desired work hours, and have folks do it that way. Another thing is stagger lunch breaks so people aren't going to be in the lunchroom. I think that you should definitely have employees wipe down the chairs that they're sitting in the lunchroom, cleaning the work area as much as possible. I think, again, having to ramp up hours for custodial staff, I think we have it here at our building, and there's not even that many people here right now.
And make sure you're telling the employees what you're doing in that regard. I mean, that is something that, we know you should be doing, and, the governor's orders are telling us that, and it makes common sense, and the CDC is telling us that. But many employees are going to be, feel better if they know that you're looking out for them. And some of it might not be as obvious, especially if work areas get cleaned after hours or things like that. So share that information.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to clearly outlining what the expectations are for your employees. You're clearly outlining what your expectations are as the employer, what you're doing to make sure that they're being safe, and hopefully that they appreciate those things. Think about max capacities in certain areas where there is congregating, like your conference room, like your lunchrooms, any sort of communal space. You want to make sure you know how many people can be in that space. I think that that's something that is required under the governor's order as well.
And I think the recommendation is 50% of the fire code, although we don't have much on our walls about fire code.
Might be hard to track that down.
Right. But again, the idea is, we see what's going on in grocery stores and things like that. That's the idea, is to stagger that space, and that's, something else that could be in your policy.
Exactly. And as far as the lunchroom itself, I've heard of places, I don't think you need to go to this extreme. If you're taking precautions where they're closing lunchrooms, just make sure that you're practicing good sanitary practices. I hate the thought of everyone using disposable plastic silverware, but I think right now that's probably the best thing to do rather than having employees worry about washing silverware and things like that, and make sure that you do have a lot of cleaning supplies in the lunchroom itself and having employees wipe down refrigerator handles and things that they're using very frequently.
So there's a question about where it said we're having a difficult time finding sanitizing cleaning supplies or their recommendations. I can tell you what I've heard is that, those disinfectant wipes are great, but a paper towel and a spray bottle with some kind of disinfectant type stuff that we use to clean up after our dogs at home, for example, works the same as what I've been told. So, we're not experts in that, but I think there are best practices alternatives, and that's one that I happen to be aware of.
Yeah, and I do know that there are a lot of local distilleries who are making hand sanitizer. So it might be a little bit further away and it might be a little bit abstract, but I know a client who got several gallons of hand sanitizer from a local distillery because they have repurposed their machinery and that's what they're doing. So it may require a little bit of a scramble. I know maybe contact your local health authority to see if they can help you obtain materials, just like masks. I think we're going to talk about masks in a second, but see if they have ideas as well. And I think Mark is right as far as the spray bottles, because I have seen a lot of those on grocery shelves, but no wipes. I still haven't seen any wipes.
Yeah, wipes are hard to find, although the Giant Eagle right around the corner from us definitely has to have them.
So the Giant Eagle and Bexley, folks. Yeah,
Watershed Distillery, that's where we just got hand sanitizer too. Watershed Distillery here in Columbus is producing hand sanitizer.
And if you are outside of the Columbus area and you don't know the local distillery, maybe talk to folks in your county and see if they're willing everyone to go in, and you can purchase it for several jurisdictions or for several entities within your county and bring it back.
Couple other questions that came up that I want to real quick address. One is, if we send somebody home and because of their temperature and they have no sick leave, do we have to put them on admin leave with pay? I think the answer is probably no, you don't. I think, first of all, you can allow them or require them to use vacation leave if they have that. And if they have no paid leave, I still think this is one of the very rare examples of when you probably send somebody home on admin leave without pay because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But please consult with your legal counsel if you do that. At least if you can't consult with them before you do it, at least right after you do it, because obviously that's something you can fix as well. Because if cases develop that say no, you really can't do that, then you pay a back pay. But I think you could do that initially.
Yeah, absolutely. And if that employee does actually test positive for COVID, maybe talk to that employee about using their emergency sick leave or something like that they're eligible for, and just reimburse them that way. But that's certainly something you can do. I agree with Mark.
And then there's another question about whether or not cubicles are going to be sufficient to shield, for social distancing purposes. Is it a safe barrier? And of course, the answer is the typical legal answer of it depends. How high are your cubicle walls? How far are they spaced out? Again, I talked to a client yesterday who was saying all employees have to wear masks, but if you're in your own cubicle and nobody else is there with you, then you don't have to wear them in there. So I think the answer is yes, but it depends on the configuration of the cubicle and whether or not there are sufficient barriers to prevent my speaking, sneezing, coughing from getting to another employee.
Yeah, I think we're
good. Contact the public. We can talk.
Oh yeah, minimizing the contact with public. No, we can talk about that at the next slide. So questionnaires for employees and customers. I know that there may be some confusion about whether you're allowed to do this. You are allowed to ask your employee these questions. In the past 14 days, have you or anyone you lived with come in contact with someone who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 or suspected to have it? Has anyone you lived with left the state of Ohio? Is anyone showing any flu-like symptoms? And if someone says yes, you want to exclude them from your workplace, perhaps. It's just like with if it's someone who, depending on what your sick leave policy says, maybe it is something that you could send that person home from. What do you think about leave in those situations, Mark, if someone says yes to those questions?
Well, I think you definitely can put them put them off on sick leave. And again, as Stephanie said, maybe they have the FFCRA sick leave, and then follow up with them, whether it's within 72 hours or 14 days or whatever the case might be. Now, the one thing that becomes a little tricky is and we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about leaves, of what if somebody has left the state of Ohio, but they're not presenting any symptoms of COVID-19, and are they, maybe that's a non-sick leave and they're on their own vacation leave situation.
Yeah, and as far as what you want to tell employees, tell them you expect them to answer truthfully. You must answer these questions truthfully. We expect this to do so. And can you ask clients or customers? You are allowed to ask this. I know that there was some discussion at the state level about this being too intrusive, but if this is something that you choose to do, you can absolutely ask these questions to people before coming into your facilities.
We've got a question here about have you seen a good definition of enclosed workspace? It seems so subjective. No and yes. No, I have not seen a good definition, and yes, I think it is pretty subjective. Again, the idea, though, keep in mind what the underlying goal is in terms of enclosed workspace and in terms of social distancing and wearing masks and everything else. It's to minimize my contact with my coworkers so I don't pass COVID-19 onto them and they don't pass it on to me. So that would be the subjective definition you need to use, I think.
And we also had a question about, is a fever alone enough to keep someone from coming to work, and a question about whether CDC guidelines have changed. I believe, and I did check this morning, that you still can exclude someone from the workplace due to fever in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that the EEOC and the CDC have cautioned that, the fever itself, it could be indicative of so many other ailments, which we know. But I think in this circumstance, you'd rather be safe than sorry. And so I think you absolutely still can prevent someone or prohibit someone from coming to work based upon the fact that they have a fever. Oh, about someone wants us to revisit, have you left the state? So if someone has left the state, I think right now, currently, while we are living in the lockdown situation, you are not supposed to be traveling outside the state and only for very specific reasons. You can ask someone about whether they've left the state and make a decision about whether you do not want that person to come to your workplace based upon where they've traveled, what their level of exposure is. And that could potentially implicate leaves under the FFCRA and the EP. I'm not going to get all the acronyms right, but it could potentially impact whether that person is entitled to that leave, that emergency paid sick leave, under the most recent legislation that was passed. But you absolutely can prohibit people from coming to work if they did travel to Florida or something like that. And
so we have a question here along those lines that if somebody goes to, let's say, Florida, poor Florida, although, I guess when you keep the beaches open, you get that reputation. Somebody travels from Florida a week and returns, so we have to pay them, like admin leave, for the 2-week quarantine, or do they use their own accrued time? So, first of all, I think this is a conversation to have with employees before they leave, if you can. You don't always know where they're going, but I think right now it's fair to ask where they're going. And again, this question, number 2, is certainly lawful, or we wouldn't be putting it up there. I believe that if an employee returns, then they have to quarantine. They probably are entitled to the FFCRA leave regarding, if they're required to quarantine. So that would cover their 2-week sick leave. If they've used any of that leave, though, then I think they are you can require them to take their own vacation leave or go on admin leave without pay. I don't think you have to allow them to take sick leave over and and above the FFCRA leave.
Unless your sick leave policy would otherwise. I've seen some wonky ones, especially ones
Okay.
in collective bargaining
Yeah.
agreements, that maybe sick leave would qualify under this circumstance.
That's a good point. So, right. But I'm talking under civil service law at least. And to the question about employees, more than just a fever, again, first of all, do we really want somebody with a fever coming to work who has a fever of 100.4? That's a separate question. We don't have to resolve that today. But I did see where the CDC or Ohio or both have added examples of symptoms that could be COVID-19. But like Stephanie said, fever alone could be enough to send someone home. So here's a question. What about a person with seasonal allergies who may occasionally cough, but they don't have a fever or shortness of breath? Are they allowed to be at work? Absolutely. They are allowed to be at work, and they should be required to be at work. And I understand that people are going to be a little ouchy because Mark's over there coughing like crazy. Actually, it's my eyes that bother me the most, and I can't touch them to scratch them. But yeah, that does not qualify for anything unless their allergies would otherwise mean they shouldn't be at work, can't work because under regular sick leave.
Yeah, if it was allergies, I wouldn't be able to work right now as well. Someone had a question about if someone is feverish or is symptomatic, if they can be asked to work from home. I think that you can ask the employee if they feel well enough to work from home, and if the employee says, no, I feel really lethargic, I don't feel well enough to do that, then you have to let them use their sick leave. But if the employee says, yeah, I'm fine, I feel like I can do my job, you absolutely can allow them to work, just not in your actual workplace.
And that's the same is true if somebody answers questions 1 or 3, and then they've come into contact with somebody who has recently been diagnosed with COVID-19. Well, you can come to work. It probably qualifies for sick leave under the FFCRA, but yeah, I mean, if you want to allow employees to telework or continue to telework, again, it's your discretion, but if they're well enough to telework, then you are good for allowing them to just work.
And so for safety issues, I know that earlier this week, the state kind of made us confused about whether we can or cannot require employees to wear masks. You absolutely can require that. You don't, for your employees. For visitors, it is also something that you can require. Mark and I both talked about this. We both believe that it's something you can require. But there are exceptions to that. Just like every lawyer answer, it depends. Employees who have underlying health conditions that may prevent them from being able to wear a mask, or maybe only allows them to wear a mask for a specific period of time, must be allowed to, you must accommodate that. So if somebody asks for a reasonable accommodation, maybe it's somebody who you've never had ask for anything like this because this is something that's very unusual. If someone says, I have asthma, I can't wear a mask for longer than, an hour or something like that, maybe talk to them about, this is a space that this person can go for a break and take an extra break or something along those lines. You can ask those normal questions that you're allowed to ask employees if they ask for reasonable accommodation. What's your underlying medical condition? How does it affect you? Why does it impact your ability to wear a mask? And I'll talk a little bit more about EEOC issues in a second. But you definitely have to accommodate employees if they do have an underlying medical condition that does not allow them to do that. Now, masks, I think that what type of mask do we have to have our employees wear? Masks, according to the CDC, have to cover the nose, the mouth, and chin at all times, but should allow for breathing without restriction as well.
So are you going to let somebody come into the office and wear a turtleneck and go over their nose and mouth? Is that sufficient?
I don't think that would be sufficient. Absolutely not.
I can't believe we're talking about this question.
Those are weird things, yes. Another thing is maybe you have to modify the mask for somebody based upon an underlying health condition as well. Another thing that I think that the EEOC has been they've been kind of vocal about as well is ensuring that people are not being retaliated against or harassed because that person either can't wear a mask or needs extra breaks to take the masks off. all of those laws still apply, and I know that there's a lot of social media shaming and things like that for people who aren't wearing masks, and I don't know what everyone's positions are on that, but employees need to know that if somebody is not wearing a mask, they can't just ask that person, why aren't you wearing a mask, what's wrong with you? You can't have people pick on that person. So everyone needs to be reminded that you do have anti-discrimination policies in place. Employees cannot be retaliated against as well. As far as members of the public, what can you do to limit client contact? They have been, I think for service-related businesses, the state has been very clear that to the extent feasible, can you do appointments? Do not allow customers to come into the building without an appointment if it's something that's feasible. Libraries, can you do curbside service for your patrons? Is that something that's available? And just like in supermarkets, for people who are coming in, if it's something where you can't just limit it to appointments, you need to have the building open, like courthouses and things like that. Have floor markers where people know how far apart 6 feet is, because I think, at least in my experience in the supermarkets, people don't necessarily understand how far apart you truly must be. I think you're required, according to the state, to disinfect high contact surfaces hourly if you provide services. So keep that in mind with your janitorial and custodial staff, or maybe have conversations with people who may be willing to do that, who sit up at the front desk, who are greeting people. And if you are a service provider, according to the state of Ohio, you have to have hours for at-risk populations. So those who are over 65 or have underlying health conditions. So that may impact some of our courthouses, or maybe even some JFSs that, Mark's getting a call, so I'm sorry, this is getting interrupted. But that's definitely something to keep in mind about those special hours if you are considered a service provider as well.
I just want to jump back on a question so we don't lose track of it. For employees who live in border counties that routinely cross state lines for work or to shop, do the same 14-day stay-at-home order apply and associated leave time? I think no.
No.
I think if it's a sporadic kind of thing, I'm crossing to do what I would normally do. If I was not crossing the border, then I think that's perfectly fine, and that would not apply in that situation. Related to the next thing.
Yeah, I think.
Question of, has the latest travel ban been extended, or does it still expire tomorrow at midnight? I think as of right now, I have not seen anything that extends the April 6th order at all. I anticipate we will see something either today or tomorrow on that, and I would be surprised if the travel ban does not. I will be surprised. I expect the travel ban to still be in place.
Yes, I agree.
Again, I don't know if that's the case, but we can, we'll wait and see. But still, as of now, the travel ban is set to expire at midnight, May 1st, but I think it'll be extended.
So safety issues as far as testing employees. Employers are permitted to administer COVID tests or have employees undergo a COVID test before allowing the employee to come back to work or to come to work. So if you feel like somebody is symptomatic, you've heard that they're symptomatic, you can require them to undergo the test. I think if you're requiring them to undergo the test, you need to help them get the test. For folks who have been tested and did test positive and are no longer positive and are coming back to work, you can require that employee to submit a fitness for duty statement from a physician or something like that. The EEOC has said to try to be lenient with those certifications as far as the format of those, whether it be an email from their physician, a call from their physician if the employee consents to that, saying this person can come back. If you are requiring the test as the employer, you are required to make sure that those tests are accurate and reliable based upon the CDC's guidance and the FDA's testing parameters. And I think as far as antibody tests, Mark has a little bit more information than I do about this issue.
Well, I want to say something about first of all, the COVID-19 test itself. That's really more applicable to the public employers who are on this call and not as much to the private employers who are on this call. I mean, everything Stephanie just said applies to all employers. But public employers also have the Constitution to worry about. And So the EEOC has said that requiring an employee to undergo a COVID-19 test is not going to be a violation of the ADA, which limits what type of medical test you can require of employees. But the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution addresses reasonable searches and seizures. A COVID-19 test likely falls under the Fourth Amendment. There is a possibility, I want to emphasize this possibility, that some court down the road could end up saying, you know what, that requiring Mark to undergo a COVID-19 test before he came back to work or as a condition of continuing to work violates his Fourth Amendment under the Constitution, and that could get a public employer in hot water. Again, I'm not saying you can't test. I'm saying this is a potential issue, and talk to legal counsel as you move forward on that. I think the antibody testing then is a little bit more mushy and unclear as we sit here at 11:45 or whatever it is, or 12 o'clock on April 30th, and it's going to change tomorrow, and it'll change next week, and it'll change as we move forward. So the antibody test is supposedly, beneficial because if you have the antibodies, maybe you don't get COVID-19 again. Maybe, until, of course, it turns into a different strain, and we won't worry about that science. But the problem, there's several problems with the antibody test. First of all, the EEOC has not said antibody tests are okay under the ADA. What the EEOC has said, as I understand it, is that the FDA has not yet told us that there is a reliable test. So until that happens, we're not going to mess with it. We're not going to mess with it until that happens. Again, I'm not saying you can't do an antibody test, but I would be very careful about that right now. And because a couple other concerns about the antibody test, again, there's a Fourth Amendment concern for public employers, and there's also a concern for all employers relating to the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which again prohibits employers from using certain genetic information, and this may or may not fall within the parameters of GINA. To say that there is, with the results of an antibody test. And again, even if the ADA allows such a test, the employer still will have to be able to establish that it's consistent with business necessity, that it's essentially mandated for business necessity, and you need to be careful about that. And so I think time will tell about the antibody test, but let's stay tuned.
Oh, yeah. So there was a question from someone about if you let one worker work from home, but then require others to return to work, do you need to have some sort of legitimate business rationale? And again, this is the typical lawyer answer. It depends. I mean, it truly does depend on the situation. It definitely depends upon the employee's job duties. If it's a job that can be done from home, if the employee has the ability to work from home, so say maybe someone doesn't have an internet connection that allows them to work from home. If it's everyone who's in the same job classification and people can work from home, and then you're requiring others to return to work, I think you do need to give some consideration as to why you're allowing some folks to work from home, whereas others are returning to work. Maybe someone has a child who needs taken care of, and they can still do their job duties from their home. That is a reason to allow that person to continue to work from home.
And keep in mind, too, working from home could, in general, be a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, whether it's COVID-19 related impairment or something else. So a couple things on that. Again, just if you allow somebody to work from home as a reasonable accommodation for COVID-19 and don't allow others, I think that's okay. As Stephanie said, if some people can't work from home to get their job done, that's another legitimate non-discriminatory distinction to make. Or if you say, look, we have 8 people who work in classification X, but we can't afford to have any more than 3 working at home at any one time for operational reasons, again, that might be another non-discriminatory reason to deny it. the EEOC has also said that the fact that you allow people to work from home during the COVID-19 pandemic should not be used as an automatic consideration or an automatic approval for employees who want to work from home sometime next year for some other ADA accommodation unrelated to COVID-19. So they're giving us some flexibility on that. Again, we'll wait and see how that plays out.
But I think you absolutely should have some sort of rationale if you're allowing it for some folks and not allowing it for others, and to keep some sort of documentation in place to establish what those reasons are, whether it be an email chain or what have you, and document conversations you have with employees about that issue.
Okay, I think we're going to talk a little bit about leave benefits now. So regarding leave benefits, there's some things to keep in mind here. And again, some of these things apply to all employers, and some of them apply only to public employers. So, for example, accrual of vacation leave. So if you have a policy that says you have a maximum amount of vacation that can be used, and it's a use or lose kind of situation, and employees aren't able to use their vacation leave because you're saying we need you to work, or you can't leave the state, or whatever the case might be, you should be considering what you're going to do in those situations. If you choose to continue the use or lose policy, that is perfectly fine and lawful. You do not have to make a distinction because it's COVID-19 related. Although, again, you can do that. But you're not required to do that. Also, you are permitted to deny vacation leave or cancel vacation leave that's already been approved. And so if you have an employee comes to you and says, I want 2 weeks, I'm going to take my 2-week vacation, and by the way, I'm going to Florida, I think you can probably say, no, I'm not granting that vacation leave because of where you're going. Be careful. I'm not saying you automatically can do that, but I think that potentially could be a consideration. And you're also certainly allowed to cancel vacation leave once it's already been approved, unless you have a collective bargaining agreement that says you can, if there are operational reasons to approve that or deny that or cancel that leave. For example, law enforcement, emergency responders, other critical businesses. If you have employees who are out or unavailable because of COVID-19 related reasons, it might become incumbent on others to be there more, and that might mean you don't get to use your vacation leave. Although God knows I want a vacation bad, but I don't want to go on vacation right now. For public employers who allow their employees to take compensatory time in lieu of paid overtime, again, that's public employers only. Do those employers, there might be provisions that say you can only earn so much compensatory time. Do you want to pay out that compensatory time if employees can't use it? Of course, they never can lose it. It always has to be paid out, even if it's at separation. And there are, of course, caps in the Fair Labor Standards Act of how much compensatory time an employee can have on the books at one time. Under the FLSA, denial of compensatory time is difficult. It has to be an undue hardship. I think needing people to work because of the COVID-19 pandemic is very likely to be considered an undue hardship that would justify denying an employee's use of compensatory time. But again, check your collective bargaining agreement. I mentioned FMLA leave here only because I want to remind folks that when it comes to FMLA leave, they should keep good records of what is counting against FMLA leave. As we've discussed previously, any FFCRA leave or extended FMLA leave for child care purposes, that FMLA leave all counts against that 12-hour allotment. So make sure you're keeping good records. Moving on to sick leave. This is not a concept in the private sector, but I certainly see it a lot in the public sector, sick leave donation. Even those of you who don't have sick leave donation policies might get some pressure to have a sick leave donation policy now in place because of the COVID-19 stuff. If you choose to do so, be very careful about how you write that policy and limiting the amount that can be donated and the amount that an employee can use, and keep some controls over that. And for both public and private employers, if you have policies that are allow for payment on or some kind of a sick leave incentive for not using sick leave, do you want to revisit those policies temporarily regarding sick leave incentives and how COVID-19 related use would apply? You do not have to. Any COVID-19 related use can be counted against an employee for sick leave incentive or an occurrence policy. That is totally your call. But these are just some things to think about a little. Now Stephanie's going to talk about EEOC stuff.
And I think there were a couple of questions that I want to go back to about masks. There were some questions about, are employers required to have employees wear masks? They are required to have employees do masks. I apologize if I made it seem like they were not required to do that, but there are circumstances where they are not required to do that, and those include it's ill-advised due to health reasons. That goes back to the ADA. It's against documented industry best practices, so if there's a safety reason or something like that. And it's not required now. The state came out with guidance where if the employee is sitting alone in their enclosed workspace, and that kind of goes back to if you do have cubes, you want to think about how far away they are and if there's anything that you need to add. There was another question about what if an employee says that the mask gives them anxiety? And this is kind of a good, segue into the EEOC guidance that we've gotten. So if somebody says the masks give them anxiety, and they say that they cannot wear the mask, or they cannot wear the mask for an extended period of time due to that anxiety, you can ask employees questions about that anxiety. Have you been diagnosed as having an anxiety disorder? If the answer to that question is no, I have not been, then you have no obligation to provide them with an accommodation of not wearing the mask or giving them extended breaks or more breaks than that person is otherwise entitled to pursuant to your general work rules or policies, unless that employee presents you with documentation from a doctor saying this person has an anxiety disorder that prohibits them from wearing a mask for extended periods of time. Because it can be considered a reasonable accommodation, certainly if that employee has a disability, but it is not a disability to just say this mask gives me anxiety and I don't want to wear it because of that. Even if that employee does not submit documentation, you are welcome to, if you want to, tell that employee and give that employee more frequent breaks, but you are not required to do so. As far as EEOC guidance, they have been clear. They came out with a bunch of, someone also asked, sorry, I want to address this. If someone has already had COVID-19, do they need to wear a mask? Yes. They still have to wear the mask. There has been nothing that has been concluded about whether or not if you have COVID, you can't come down with COVID. Certainly that is the thought, but there is no medical study, I think, that has come to that conclusion. Like I said, the EEOC has been clear that requiring symptomatic employees to stay home, you're allowed to do that. It is not discriminatory at all. I already mentioned that you can require employees to submit a fitness for duty verification before they're allowed to come back to work if they did in fact have COVID. For the confidentiality of medical records, just like all other medical records, they have to be sequestered from personnel files. But you are allowed, if you do have an employee who is diagnosed with COVID, to notify your local health authority of the name of the employee if the employee tests positive or notifies you that they do have a positive test. Obviously, you should not be running around the workplace telling everyone else there that this employee has in fact tested positive, but you should document some contact tracing and do some contact tracing and notify the local health authority of that information, and discreetly as possible potentially let employees know that they've potentially been exposed to COVID. The EEOC has also said that if you are hiring right now, which may be a luxury that people are not even thinking about, but you may need some folks for certain positions, you can only screen applicants for symptoms of COVID-19 after you've given them a job offer. So you cannot require people coming into your building to undergo medical testing if you haven't given them a job offer yet.
And that includes asking them those questions that we said you can ask employees. I don't think you can ask them those questions of have you been out of state or those kind of things, because I think those are medical-related inquiries. So what do you think, Stephanie?
I think you can ask them if they have, you can ask them the questions, because I don't think that those are medical, with whether or not you've been out of state isn't a medical inquiry.
Can you ask them if you, okay, but can you ask them if they have had symptoms of COVID-19 before a conditional offer of employment is made?
I think that would be, I think you can ask them. I don't think you can require them to undergo a medical test.
Okay.
I don't think you can do that. But you can also withdraw a job offer if an applicant who you have given a job offer to has COVID and you need that in person to start immediately. So if you need custodial workers, if you need janitorial staff, and that person says, I just got tested positive, you can say, okay, well, we can't hire you then. That was clear. And then reasonable accommodations, like Mark said, you can, because of this weird time we're in, you can put an end date to a reasonable accommodation that you give someone. Maybe you allow someone to telework without having the medical documentation you're otherwise entitled to before giving someone an accommodation during this crisis, and you can set an end date for that accommodation right now. And you can also opt to provide accommodations on an interim or short-term basis and test run different accommodations while you're awaiting the medical documentation. The EEOC is giving employers a lot more leeway, not a lot, but more leeway than normal when it comes to reasonable accommodations as well.
And keep in mind that a reasonable accommodation is not the best accommodation. It's not the one the employee insists on or wants. It's what is reasonable under the circumstances.
And the EEOC has also come out with guidance on undue hardship. So whether something is, an accommodation is something you can actually accommodate right now, whether it is in fact reasonable. So things that previously would not have posed an undue hardship may now pose one. So if someone teleworking and things change and you need someone for operational purposes to come back to work and do their job, that's still going to be and it's an undue hardship for them to continue to work at home, you are allowed to say that we have to have you come back to work. And it also may be harder to provide temporary assignments or remove non-essential functions. And the big question, financial difficulties. Previously, something that the EEOC was really not willing to accept or very rarely willing to accept as an undue hardship. They have said in their guidance that things that previously were not too financially difficult for you, based upon financial circumstances after the crisis, may now be an undue hardship as well. And one thing that I think we all need to be, the FFCRA and all those leaves, you may exempt essential workers from those, but you cannot exempt essential workers from reasonable accommodations. So I wanted to mention that and keep folks aware of that as well. I think. Okay, so employees, so we're going to talk a little bit about issues you may have with employees. We've kind of categorized employees in 3 different ways. So if someone has an underlying health condition that could be exacerbated by COVID-19, or the employee's family member has a underlying health condition that can be exacerbated by COVID-19, you can require medical documentation just like you always could. The EEOC has said try to be somewhat lenient with that right now because doctors' offices are closed. We know they're reopening as well. You still have to engage in the interactive process, but it can be somewhat limited. If someone says they cannot come to work because of their own underlying health condition and they're afraid of exposure to COVID, and then can you require that employee to use sick or vacation leave? I think you absolutely can if they're saying that. If it's because of a member of their own household, I don't think that that employee is entitled to leave unless it is because that employee, because a member of the household has COVID. That would implicate the FFCRA. or if that person has a serious health condition and the employee is needed to take care of that individual, just like under FMLA is otherwise. But if it's just my child has asthma and I'm afraid to come to work because I don't want to expose my child to COVID by going into the workplace, I do not think you have to require or accommodate, you don't have to accommodate that and allow that employee to use leave. I also think it could be a really slippery slope if you do, because there's so many reasons and so many things that someone could say I can't come to work for. So as far as teleworking, you definitely can talk to that employee about those things. And then can you prohibit that employee from working because they have an underlying health condition? I've had clients come to me and say, I'm worried about so-and-so. I'm afraid for them to come to work. If that employee chooses to come to work, that is their choice. You cannot require them, unless they are unable to perform the essential functions of their job, you cannot prohibit that person from working. And then I think we have on there that person may be entitled to unemployment. They may, if they refuse to work and are otherwise terminated.
If they're unable to work, and again, I don't think they have to just refuse.
Yes.
Yeah, if they assert this reason and then they are otherwise terminated or in an unpaid status for an extended period under current circumstances, they may be entitled to unemployment.
And then employees who will not work if employees are over the age of 65. Again, probably entitled to use sick or vacation leave if they are refusing to come to work because of their age and they don't want to be exposed as well. Same exact things. Teleworking are things that you can allow that individual to do. That is not something that will qualify for FMLA. And if that person does in fact, get separated, that person could potentially be entitled to unemployment as well. And then I think on the next slide, we have Mark's writing down your questions, so forgive us for trying to adapt as well. But the employees who cannot or will not work. So if you have someone who is refusing to work because they have a situation where they have a child at home who has asthma and they're afraid to come to work, if that is your situation, that person is likely not entitled to use their sick leave. They would not be entitled to FMLA, and you can require that employee to come to work. And if they refuse to do that, you tell this person, you have to be here. They can be considered absent without leave, and you can separate that person from employment. Obviously, there are issues with just cause and things like that, but especially right now in certain jobs, you need people there, you need workers on the ground. If someone is refusing to come to work, you can certainly discipline them and potentially separate them from employment. We have on there that that person may not or likely is not entitled to unemployment. Obviously, that is not your call. That is up to the state to determine that. And like I said earlier, just be really careful about making exceptions for employees who have specific circumstances. We're not trying to be heartless, but you do have to do your job and provide services to folks. So be really careful if you are presented with those types of situations and document them.
Yeah, and so for public employers, you also have due process issues to worry about, or collective bargaining issues, whether it's public or private employers. So make sure you're jumping through those hoops too, and communicate with the employee. Try to work something out if you can. We don't want to be in the middle of a disciplinary case right now if you can avoid it. So maybe the employee gets to take a couple of days of vacation leave to figure out what the heck they want to do, or unpaid leave, but ultimately, if you have to give them an ultimatum, put it in writing. You are ordered, you are expected, you are required, I guess is the best word, to be in the office at your desk tomorrow at 9 a.m. And if you're not, there are going to be consequences up to and including potential termination. The couple questions that I want to work back to. There were some questions, and I don't know. Can you require employees to re-wear masks? I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
They need to be, unless they're the disposable kind. I think there's best practices for washing them, but again, that doesn't mean they can't be hand washed and hung to dry each night if need be. So if an employee only has one mask, they can re-wear them.
Finding masks.
Yeah,
no,
So somebody asks, well, what do we do if we can't get our hands on masks? Again, I think you could be a little bit creative, but I just read where county EMAs are getting a delivery from the state of a lot of masks. I know it might not be enough, but check with your county EMA, check with the health department. Those are two places to look at off the top of my head, at least. I had a question about whether or not you can ask volunteers the same questions about COVID-19 and being away, being out of state, and those kinds of things. Absolutely, you can. You can ask those questions of volunteers. You can probably even ask those questions of customers and clients who are coming into your office before you let them in your office. Not probably, I think you can. We got a couple questions about the 65 and older category. So one question is if an employee is in the group of,
It's a group that's more susceptible, over 65.
Over 65, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
But has been and could continue to telework but want to work back in the building. Can we refuse that and require them to telework? It's definitely a really interesting question. I think that if the employee wants to come back to work, it's really up to you if you want to order them to stay at home or not. I think you can if you want to, but I think you need to.
You should not order them to stay at home just because they're 65 and older. I think there's some potential issues there.
That is true, yes.
Potential.
That's true.
Potential age discrimination issues there. So that's one issue. And again, overall with the 65 and older folks, CDC guidelines say those over 65 and older are more susceptible and therefore should take more precautions. If a 65-year-old employee or older comes to you and says, I don't feel comfortable working, we would strongly recommend that you let them off the hook and not require them to work as a potential reasonable accommodation if telework is not an option or if some other options aren't available. I mean, again, there might be an option available where they could come to work on a staggered work schedule that might expose them to fewer employees. Talk to these employees and don't just automatically say yes or no. Figure out what the circumstances are and how you can potentially make them feel more comfortable.
Yeah, I agree with you now that I think about it more. But yes, I think that's something that actually when I was reading the EEOC guidance that they actually did specifically say you cannot just tell this person you can't come to work because you're older. That was something that was in the EEOC guidance. So.
And we just had a question. Can a public agency require visitors to wear masks? Yes. It is totally your option on visitors. The employer gets to decide, must they wear masks or will they be absolved of that responsibility? There might be some ADA issues that could arise in very limited circumstances, and I'm not going to dive into that in too much detail because I think that would be very rare. So now we're going to talk about teleworking a little bit. Now, we've talked about teleworking at prior webinars, and many of you who are doing teleworking hopefully it's going kind of smooth or relatively smoothly, but we thought it made sense to revisit teleworking now that we're talking about employees coming back to work, because my sense is that there are employers out there who are saying you could telework and just give me a decent effort and don't take advantage, whether that's said or unsaid. Just like there's employers out there who are saying that employees, we'll pay you a week to work and a week not to work. Those employees also will, employers are being lenient, but I think at some point we're going to get to be a little bit more, you're going to need people to actually work, and teleworking might not be, if it's an option, it still needs to be a little more lenient, I think, than it doesn't have to be as lenient as it has been perhaps. So again, have a policy. We have a policy on our website, and that reminds me, if we haven't said it already, both the recording and the PowerPoint will be on our website later this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest of this webinar. So have a policy and make sure you're enforcing that policy, understanding that with EEOC guidelines, there might be some issues concerning the, teleworking as a reasonable accommodation, which we've already talked about. So a couple of examples, and we have a couple of things on our website if you haven't used it already. We have a teleworking policy for work, for employers, but also a best practices kind of checklist for employees to pay attention to. So, the policy should say that employees need to have a work area that at home or wherever they're working that can be productive, that they have to be available for phone calls and emails, meaning that it has to be relatively quiet. Again, I know there's leniency, especially when people have kids at home and those kinds of issues. But as we move more towards reopening, as I said before, the teleworking might be something that we need to do more. We need to be more productive in our teleworking. Employees absolutely should be required to report their starting and quitting times, and also the times they're not working if they are FLSA non-exempt people. You want them to know that if they are to report their starting and quitting times, or if they're at lunch or they're taking time to be with their kid or whatever the case might be, they need to be reporting that. Figure out what works best for you in terms of reporting. You should have a policy that specifically says while you are teleworking, and this can go beyond teleworking as well, employees are not authorized to work overtime without prior approval, and this is how you get prior approval, so you don't run into FLSA questions later on. The policy should make it clear that employees have to maintain confidential information in a confidential manner so that members of their family aren't able to look at their screen or any documents they might have at their kitchen table or wherever they're working, and that make it clear that the employer is not responsible if the employee has a bad or inadequate or no internet connection or those kinds of things. If the employee is not set up to work at home and you choose not to provide them equipment which is in your authority, then you can exempt them from teleworking. So.
And also, I know that we want to be really careful about cybersecurity right now. So if you require a VPN or something like that, you can talk to your employees about what is required to ensure there is a secure connection. And just be very careful about logging in and remote access and all of those things, double authentication, things that we talked about. We have a question about what about employees who have underlying health conditions such as diabetes or other things that have been specified by the CDC as exacerbating COVID-19, and they don't want to report to work. If that person is unable to telework, or if they're unable to telework and they are afraid to come to work, I think that those are circumstances, obviously depending on the documentation and what the job is and how much you can require them to use their leave, their sick leave, depending on what the policy says, or maybe even make exceptions in this and document it, require them to use their sick leave, their vacation leave, their comp time, and maybe it gets to a point where they're in an unpaid status and you can approve unpaid periods of leave. Look at what your policies say, but those are things that I think you should talk to those employees about. And talk to those employees about getting medical documentation and submitting that to you. You can I guess, based upon the EEOC's guidance, you can give them an extended period of time to do that. But just talk to your employees, and those are things you are allowed to do.
Got a question here. Can public employers required to provide services to the public deny service if the member of the public refuses to wear a mask, such as the example given here is visiting a child in supervised visitation at an agency, if there's a court-ordered visitation, for example. I think the answer is yes, you can. I think you need to be careful and try to explore why the individual's refusing to wear a mask. If the answer is because the government can't tell me what to do, I'm comfortable telling you that you can refuse that, although I would revisit that issue at the court at some point. If it's for a medical reason, then I think you need to explore ADA issues because, again, the ADA also applies to obtaining government services. And then if there's, again, have the dialogue with the member of the public before you absolutely refuse. But if it's a big old, you can't tell me what to do, then I think the answer is you don't get those services.
Yeah, I agree with Mark on that.
No shirt, no shoes, no service, or mask.
Exactly.
You want to?
Yeah, we'll just briefly touch on this because I think we have a lot of stuff still that we wanted to talk about, but employee discipline, obviously insubordination is something that may come into play here. If you have a situation where an employee says the government can't tell me to wear a mask and I want to wear a mask, I don't want to wear a mask, you can tell that employee that unless they have a valid reason, like an ADA issue or something like that, that they are required to wear the mask, and if they refuse to do that, you can certainly discipline them. As far as comments, I think we've had several clients who have had issues with people posting things on social media about the crisis, about government response to the crisis, things like that. We still have to think about the First Amendment. If you're a public employer, you have to look at what that employee is saying and whether that is disrupting your operations. If it's, I hate my employer for making me wear a mask, masks are stupid, this is really dumb, and someone going off, you can certainly discipline an employee for doing that. I don't know that it makes sense to do that, but I digress. But if it's someone saying, you know, I disagree, this is just like the protesters down at the State House, and they're voicing their support for those protesters, that is something that you cannot discipline an employee for posting about. If it's, I hate Mike DeWine, I hope someone, you know, imposes harm on him, that's a different story. That's something that you could potentially discipline an employee for. But
the other area that you're going to have to be careful about in this, for public employers, there's First Amendment and whistleblower issues, and we're going to talk about whistleblower here in a sec. And for private employers, it's more of a whistleblower issue, are those employees who are going on Facebook and saying, my employer X doesn't care about my safety, they're not taking proper precautions, those kinds of things. That's where a public employer has to be careful about the First Amendment being implicated. Not saying you can't protect them, and again, as the slide says, false statements are not constitutionally protected.
that is correct.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about some whistleblower protections, as I just mentioned. The first one on your screen here applies to public employees only. Ohio Revised Code, Section 124.341. It applies to classified and unclassified employees. So even unclassified employees can get protections under the statute. It requires them to file a written report, and I should say all of these whistleblower statutes or regulations really, there's an expectation that employees are going to cross the T's and dot the I's pretty significantly. So the written report is required alleging a violation of state or federal law or rule or a misuse of funds. Again, the employer has to take some due diligence to investigate that claim, and doesn't have to agree with the claim. If the employee is wrong, then they're wrong. Of course, retaliation is prohibited, even if it's an inaccurate claim or report that's being filed, and anybody who believes they're being retaliated against can appeal to the State Personnel Board of Review, again, even unclassified employees. Then next, we have Ohio Revised Code Section 4113.52, which applies to all employees, public and private. It involves a report that employee orally notifies the employer of a violation of state, federal, local law that the employer has the authority to correct. So it could be, you have to make all of our guests wear a mask, all the visitors wear a mask. That would be something that you don't have the authority to correct because there's no state, federal, or local law requiring that. Whereas perhaps employees wearing masks is something that is a violation of a state law through the Ohio Department of Health modified order that we should see in the next day or two. The employee orally notifies the employer. The employer must make a good faith attempt to correct that violation within 24 hours. Must submit. Then if it's not fixed within 24 hours, the employee must submit in writing to the public official who can address that problem. And then, again, the public official still has an expectation of addressing that problem. If it's not addressed, then the employee can go to other avenues. I mean, that might be where the employee goes to the public or the Department of Health outside the agency. And again, retaliation is prohibited. So, like I said, I can envision a scenario where somebody, a private or public employer, has an elected official or an employee or department head who says, I'm not wearing a mask. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it. And that could potentially fall within this category of 4113.52. We got a question here. If your policy was employees have the discretion to wear a mask or not to wear a mask, and then an employee who did not wear a mask got sick after returning to work from another coworker, do you think the employer's policy was unreasonable here, or was the employee's conduct unreasonable? So right now, according to what we know from the Ohio Department of Health and the governor, employers cannot have a policy that gives employees discretion to wear a mask or not to wear a mask. Employees must wear a mask. I think it's unlikely, though, that the employer will, look, it's hard to say. There's going to be so many factors here in determining whether or not an employee was, an employer is liable. It is unlikely, though, that an employer is reasonably going to be held liable for most COVID-19 related illness stuff. So an employee gets COVID-19. How's that employee going to prove they got it from that coworker who wasn't wearing a mask? Again, having said that, though, the threshold question can't be ignored. I don't think you can currently have a policy giving employees discretion on wearing a mask or not wearing a mask unless it's for an ADA type accommodation.
I agree.
Final whistleblower, this only applies to private employers for the Occupational Health and Safety Act, federal law. This law has a general duty clause. Employers must provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Again, retaliation is prohibited. The employee report is it has to be reasonable and made in good faith. And if there is retaliation or failure to act on the employer, then an OSHA complaint can be filed within 30 days. Going back real quick to 4113.52, I meant to mention that a lawsuit has to be filed within 180 days of the action that the employee is questioning. So it's a pretty short time frame to get to court if that's what's going to happen. So the rest of the slides are going to be collective bargaining oriented. I know there are some people in the audience here who might not have to deal with collective bargaining issues. But so I wanted to give you that heads up. It's not like we may touch on other issues as well. Obviously, everyone's welcome to stay, and we'd love you to stay. Just wanted to give you that roadmap. Real quick question, though, another mask question for public employers. Are police officers, firefighters, public works employees required to wear masks? I think the answer is yes, but I think there are some exceptions because and I wish I had these in front of me. There are some exceptions that is in I just read it this morning. It was issued yesterday by the state. It's on the coronavirus Ohio website. Stephanie thinks she wrote them down, maybe.
I think I did. It said that you're not required to wear a mask if it's not advised due to health reasons. It's against documented industry best practices. It's against a safety policy, or it's prohibited for a specific position by law or regulation. Is that what you read?
That's what I read. So that could apply to all police officers, for example. There might be some safety reasons why we don't want our police officers to be wearing masks all the time. So, I think that's an issue.
Yeah, I think maybe if there was like an active shooter situation or something like that, or they're running and they're trying to catch a suspect. I think there are multiple situations where a police officer might not be advised about them to wear a mask.
What about construction workers who are not wearing masks now and employers are not requiring it? I think it's required. I don't think you can just say I'm social distancing. Now, again, the requirement goes into effect supposedly May 1st at midnight. We haven't seen the updated rule yet. They're just giving us a preview of that. So
yeah, I think as far as for construction workers, if there was some sort of safety regulation or something like that prohibited them from wearing it, maybe they need to communicate with each other. I'm not sure, but if there is a specific thing that would prohibit it, I think you're allowed to not have those folks wear masks. But unless that's the case, I think you have to. And
you should document those reasons if you're going to rely on that.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that we've kind of ignored a lot lately, not a lot, but more than we would have in other situations, is the collective bargaining obligations. And for public employers in Ohio, the obligation to bargain under Ohio law, Chapter 4117, is really broad. Anything that affects wages, hours, terms, and conditions of employment. That is a broad list. Having said that, though, you have had a need and continue to have a need to respond to the pandemic, your obligations under the pandemic to provide services, keep employees safe. So maybe you have changed work hours or things like that without bargaining. And, at this point, the union is going along with that because of the realities. That's going to change at some point. Collective bargaining agreements, generally speaking, don't really reflect the reality of what you might need to do today or in the near future. Although you should certainly check and take a look at your emergency provisions in the contract, although many of those emergency provisions only pertain to things like time frames for responding to grievances and, minor things like that. So again, as I said, the duty to bargain is broad, affects wages, hours, terms, and conditions of employment. How do your work rules fit in with this duty to bargain? You're changing work rules. It may be something that's not in a collective bargaining agreement, but it changes quote unquote past practice. Again, there's at least at a minimum likely to be a duty to confer with the union. There might be darn good reasons why you can't confer in advance, but I would strongly recommend that you reach out to the union when it is feasible and say, look, we're willing to discuss these things maybe in the next couple of weeks, or if you have questions, let us know, things like that, because I think that the employers that come out best in the end of all of these things are the ones that attempt to fulfill their duty to bargain, and keeping in mind that in many situations, a duty to bargain does not mean a duty to reach an agreement. It means you have to go through the process and make sure that you are operating in good faith.
Yeah, I think I've had folks, hazard pay is something that has been brought up to me by a client. Someone can certainly ask you to bargain about it right now, but I think you're perfectly fine saying, sure, we'll talk to you about it. We won't agree to it. Right.
Or you could say, we aren't going to talk about that now because we haven't, that's something you probably don't have to bargain about now. But yeah, you certainly don't have to agree to it.
Yeah, and you can say, yeah, we'll talk about it now, but obviously considering the financial straits we're all under, not necessarily something that's feasible. So
as you're about to see here, there are some cases that service decided over the past 15 to 20 years that give the employers, public employers, some authority to make changes that might actually arguably violate the collective bargaining agreement, yet because of exigent circumstances, the employer was able to do that, to make those changes. But I would emphasize to you, don't be greedy about that. Focus on what needs you have. Maybe there are needs that you have specifically relating to work hours. Maybe there are needs that you specifically have in an effort to save money because of the resulting economic downturn from coming out of the pandemic. So the first case, or the biggest case, is the City of Toledo case. So in this case, exigent circumstances justified midterm changes to a collective bargaining agreement. Keeping in mind that these midterm changes were made after the city bargained with the union. The city was facing a 24% reduction in funding, in revenue, and they needed to make some changes. They made changes requiring employees to pay more for health insurance than the contracts required, and wanted to eliminate or did eliminate a pension contribution for some bargaining unit employees. And the key, again, was that they bargained with this and other unions. They got all the other unions to agree except one, and they were able to show there were exigent circumstances. But please keep in mind, it depends on very specific facts and circumstances in the particular situation. And, of course, these changes still could be subject to the grievance procedure. So you might be home free from a collective bargaining, from an unfair labor practice charge standpoint, but not from a grievance arbitration standpoint. Again, the case, another Toledo case, this one arising out of Toledo District Board of Education, established and said that a party cannot modify an existing collective bargaining agreement without negotiation by an agreement of both parties unless immediate action is required due to exigent circumstances that were unforeseen at the time of negotiations or legislative action taken by a higher legislative body after the agreement became effective that requires a change to conform to the statute. So, for example, under Ohio law, and as broad as Ohio's collective bargaining law is, the obligation to wear masks is probably a mandatory subject of bargaining. I think clearly a rule that says you shall wear masks fits within both exigent circumstances, and it's not a legislative action, but it's a action by a higher level of government, the state, saying all employees shall wear masks. So that's an example. But again, keep in mind, if the union says we want to bargain over that, you may have to bargain with them, even though you don't have to agree to any changes they want. So, of course, we're looking at revenue issues, revenue downfalls here that are unknown at this time. So some of the things to think about here are you currently in negotiations? And if so, are there wage proposals or other economic proposals that have been hanging out and now left hanging because we can't meet? I would strongly recommend you withdraw those proposals before the union can accept those, because I've had that in a couple situations, or occur in a couple situations, and I think in both situations the unions are going to be sorry they didn't accept what the employer had offered back in February. But to play it safe, you better withdraw those proposals. For those of you who are dealing with upcoming negotiations, is there a benefit? Can the parties agree to just extend the current agreement? Although the current agreement might not be satisfactory to you as an employer, you might need to get some relief on things like economic issues, health insurance premium contributions, health insurance coverage in general, layoffs or furlough kind of language. So, that's an option, but it may not be an option for everyone. There are also some entities that are not going to get hit nearly as hard, financially, that's just the reality, so I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all approach either. Keep in mind that you may want to negotiate concerning layoffs with the union to see what other kind of alternatives there might be to just laying off the least senior employees. But I think to be successful in those negotiations, it's important to try to share as much information as possible with the union and with the employees. And what other alternatives are there to layoffs? What other cost savings have you developed in other areas? What other layoffs have occurred outside the bargaining unit that might help persuade the employees?
I mean, I think that what Mark's saying is true, and I also think that if you are experiencing financial difficulties or you believe you will be experiencing financial difficulties, crunch the numbers. Look at the numbers, because I have had experiences where they say there is no money there, and then you look at the actual funds that are available, and there's no way that's a viable argument. So, and it might not be now that you know how much you're affected, especially for counties, and relying on sales taxes, income, or sales tax collections and things like that. But analyze the finances before you just say, we can't afford this.
Keeping in mind that under 100% correct. Also under civil service law, it's current or projected, and I think that same standard, depending on the language in your collective bargaining agreement, may apply as well. So, and of course, if you're in negotiations, like I said before, revisit the layoff language. It seems like we look at this once every 10 years, if that, when something hits the fan, like the banking crisis of 2008 or the COVID-19 crisis And I'm not sure they had to worry about it during the 1918 flu pandemic.
Probably not.
We do now. So that is what we wanted to talk about. We thank you very much for your participation and staying with us through our technical difficulties. Again, you have our contact information right there, and we would be happy to try to help you out if you have any follow-up questions or concerns. And with that, we are going to sign off. Thank you very much.
Thank you.